Thank you so much for having me, and good evening to all of you. I want to start by, well, maybe I should start by sharing my screen. Yeah, does that work? Okay. So I want to thank Leslie and Omar and the students at Cooper Union for inviting me to talk tonight. Not only because I find myself in such great company with such an impressive list of speakers as part of this series, but also because it involves not just a lecture, but an opportunity to have a more in-depth follow-up conversation with students, which I'm looking forward to. So I want to start tonight by plugging the work of my brother-in-law. Here's his website. His name is Jose Berrio. He's an illustrator and graphic designer from Colombia who now lives in New York. So for those of you who might be looking for an illustrator, here's your guy. He's particularly good at making record covers. So if there's any musicians out there, then I will just quickly put his email in the chat. How do I do that? Maybe Omar, you can help me do it. It's contact@joseberrio.com, because I have to like undo the screen share and it's complicated. Okay, great. Thank you. I realize that this seems like starting off of a talk with an ad or with a message from my sponsor, but the real reason that I bring up my brother-in-law is because I want to share a short video that he made and posted on social media about a year ago. So let me play it. That's Jose, obviously. I have a lot to say about this video, so I'm going to play it a few times throughout the lecture. And while I'm a big admirer of the new music organization called Bang on a Can, my brother-in-law's video was actually the inspiration for the title of my lecture, even if he's mostly banging on jars and bottles and not cans. But this little video manages to summarize, at least for me, a lot about what has drawn me to art and to making a career as a curator of contemporary art. There's something in here to me about abstraction and a form of communication that takes place outside of language. There's something about how multiplicity and individuality are always entangled and happening at the same time as each other, on top of each other. There's something about mark making and forms of inscription. There's something about alignment as a form, there's something about misalignment as a form of alignment, or what the writer Fred Moten calls ensemble, where the force behind collectivity or sociality or politics is not a search for consensus, but a polyrhythmic coexistence of difference. I think there's something here about the distinction that the theorist Trinh Minh Ha makes between speaking about, speaking for, and speaking nearby. There's something about the body and the heartbeat, something about skill and expertise, and something about joy. I love how this little video manages to take a simple object and make it a little bit more complicated. So I'm going to try to talk about each of these ideas and how they relate to my own thinking about art, about exhibition making, and how they are also informing my current research on an upcoming exhibition that I'm working on. So I know that it seems like I want to talk about music, but I don't. Or what I want to do is talk about music as a way to talk about art and politics. Or maybe a better way to put that is that I want to talk about art and politics by using a musical vocabulary. There's a famous line by Jean-Luc Godard where he says, "The problem is not to make political films, but to make films politically." Which is kind of what I mean when I say that I don't actually want to talk about music or about what art has to do with music, but I want to talk about art and politics musically. Music is a visceral thing that's really hard to talk about. Miles Davis once said, "I do not play jazz." And what he meant, I think, is that he plays something that invents its own vocabulary. A vocabulary that is shared only by those who don't need to know what to call it, or how to contain it within language, or how to describe it. The internet doesn't seem to have figured out the exact proper credit line for this quote, but it seems at least one of these people famously put it, talking about music is like dancing about architecture. I'm not a musician myself, or a music expert, or a music critic, but I do have a long history of being involved with music in various ways and writing about music in various books and magazines. But I can't really start off this talk without saying a few very general things about music, which I realize will have to involve a little bit of dancing about architecture. So here's one very general thing one can say about music. Music is processed by the body. Or perhaps it's best to say that it first passes through the body before it reaches the mind. And since music is often a little bit too much for the mind, it tends to overflow back into the body and lead to things like tapping, rocking back and forth, and so on. Music impacts the body. It implicates and enlists the body. Without being mediated by language or logic, music touches the body and makes it move. In that sense, music is less a concept that needs decoding than a vibration that triggers other vibrations, which then create form of pleasure, pain, or combinations of both. And that's why music is often compared to sex. Just last week, during a studio visit, an artist used a phrase that I'll borrow here. Can something be sex, but also be text? Music is one of those things that can be both. It tickles the body and also the brain. It's ephemeral and intermittent, but also carries meaning that makes a lasting impact. Music cross-pollinates not just between sounds, but between languages, traditions, histories, and forms of knowledge and subjectivity. It can embody an abstract feeling, but it can also give structure to an entire social order. Let's try another very general statement about music. Music is a collective activity. People make music with others and play music to others. We form groups like bands, and members who each play distinct roles work together to form a conversation between equals, where each brings something different to the table. We gather, sometimes by the thousands, to stand together in crowded stadiums and clubs. Music plays a significant role in creating a sense of belonging to something larger. In that sense, music provides a useful framework or vocabulary with which to talk about the political. Communities or social political dynamics are often described in terms of improvisations, compositions, or rhythms. One last one. Music can also be private, domestic, and a deeply personal experience, central to constructing a sense of personal identity or to satisfying a kind of basic need. We all recently witnessed, I think, a beautiful example of music being both a private experience and a collective one at the same time, and which created a sense of belonging to a specific time and place. I can try to say more about why this represents something powerful, but I think that everyone has already felt the answer to that question somewhere in their body. Right before he died in 1992, the French Marxist philosopher and sociologist Henri Lefebvre developed a critique of capitalism, or of the body under capitalism, by attempting to understand the nature of rhythm. His book, Elements of Rhythm Analysis, was divided into biological, psychological, and social rhythms. Everywhere where there is interaction, this is a quote, everywhere where there is interaction between a place, a time, and an expenditure of energy, he wrote, there is rhythm. It's clear that when stretched past the narrow lens of music or musical structure, words like rhythm or score or tone can be applied to vast areas of study, from biology and engineering to politics and aesthetics. In 2012, the curator Natasha Ginwala organized the Museum of Rhythm as part of Anselm Franke's Taipei Biennial. In it, she uses rhythm as a way to imagine a museum where history itself, or a range of historical moments and voices, is given pitches, frequencies, and tempos. She argued that when history is conceived as a rhythm, it can be reorganized. Instead of a linear progression of winners and losers, it can become a polyrhythm of overlapping and colliding parallel stories that coexist with delays, repetitions, reversals, accidents, and other rhythmic characteristics. Perhaps even the complexities of colonial and post-colonial consciousness, both past and present, could be mobilized and disrupted by way of rhythmic coherences and incoherences. The human condition has always been a polyrhythmic experience of overlapping and coexisting differences. Most commonly, our approach has been to manage and often oppress those differences by developing organizing systems like governments, religions, ideologies, always to the benefit of some at the expense of others. The more abstract logic of rhythm might provide a model, if only a metaphorical one, for organizing our societies differently. And to do that, I think we need to watch Jose's video one more time. What's clear here is that consensus is not the goal. Jose doesn't begin with all the rhythms being different and then gradually work towards making them increasingly similar or more aligned with each other. No, the strength of the performance comes from precisely how each component is not like any of the others and yet wants to coexist with them. The structure of polyrhythms embodies the paradox that contradiction and disagreement can form the basis of a productive relationship, which strikes me as particularly resonant in our current climate. If socio-political forces once tried to strive towards sameness, towards consensus, towards a utopia of a colorblind society where everyone could be the same, we're now recognizing that what's so important about our communities is difference. What we need to more forcefully recognize and celebrate is not how similar we all are, but how different. I already mentioned the writer Fred Moten, who is a great example of someone who talks about music in a way, as a way to say something about art, about politics, about race, about philosophy. And he doesn't just use a musical vocabulary to do so, but he writes musically. He writes theory in the key of free jazz, which is not to say that he theorizes jazz, but that he theorizes in concepts that have a specific rhythm to them, where a particular syncopation and beat connects one sentence or word or idea to the next one. I'll borrow a phrase that he uses to describe Cecil Taylor and say that Moten himself is a writer who communicates on frequencies outside and beneath the range of reading. In a conversation he had with the artist Wu Tsang, he said that all we are instruments. The beat becomes the buzz, he said. So it makes sense that his own writing performs the blur and the beat that he is writing about. But I wanted to pause for a moment on what he does to the word ensemble, because he pushes it the way a horn player pushes the bend of an A or an F. I presume we all know what an ensemble is. If a band has a fixed group of members, an ensemble usually has a changing cast of characters who still form a cohesive unit. What I find so useful with Moten is how he transformed the word from a noun into a condition. His ensemble is not a group of people, but a state of improvisation, of generative and collective becoming, of thinking without a center and beyond singularity or totality. Ensemble with him is the undoing of the ability to locate. It's not a point of intersection, but a potentiality where spaces between identities overlap but are not bridged. Ensemble cuts and refuses to close. An ensemble refers not to a specific situation, but to the totality of an ecosystem, to everything that's generated by a situation, everything that emerges from it, everything that's entangled within it, and everything that works to oppose or contradict it. To transform the word a bit more and to stretch it until it becomes a verb would give us the ability to ensemble. What would it mean to ensemble a shape, an image, a body, or even an entire community? To ensemble a law, to ensemble a museum or an exhibition? It wouldn't mean to complete or to bridge or even to harmonize, but it would refer to something messier and more unruly, something harder to contain, like an augmentation or a multiplication via an act of improvisational rupture. To ensemble is to deal with intensities and is perhaps best measured in decibels. One way to think about art is not to ask what it is, but to ask what it does. And so what if art is a way to ensemble? For years, I've thought that what art does really well is to complicate. It takes something from the world and complicates it. An artwork can take something as simple as a square, an apple, a color, a box, or a face, things we've seen a million times and think we know everything about, and recomplicate them or make them into something we need to decipher all over again. An artwork inserts a lack or a void or a trap into the fabric of the known and creates the necessity to fill that void with knowledge or meaning. To do that, we might need things like language, like taste, like politics, like history, like subjectivity, like ethics. But each of those are separate from art. They are decomplication tools or mechanisms that we use to organize knowledge and to make sense out of the sensible. The artistic act, at least in my view, is the one that causes the initial complication, that tears the whole or ties the knot, and that triggers the need for all of these many other mechanisms to be set into motion. Obviously, many artists are like good criminals who know what will be triggered as soon as the crime is committed, and who know what the police's playbook is going to be. And so they embed those mechanisms into the nature of the artwork. So maybe they don't complicate as much as they ensemble. Artists and writers have long used a musical metaphor to talk about art. The artist David Hammond says, "I'm trying to make abstract art out of my experience, just like Thelonious Monk." A painting is described in terms of its tone, its rhythm, its notes. Exhibitions have a tempo, a cadence, a beat. Personally, when I curate an exhibition, my goal is not to make a point or to illustrate a theme, but to create a temperature, a vibration, maybe even some kind of music. When I sit down to write an essay about art, I start off by thinking about the key I want to write it in. And when I move into a new job, I think of an institution as a place that has specific instruments that can be used to interpret and perform a score. I really like the metaphor of a score. When writing a score, a composer is making music, but is also giving music. By definition, a score is for others. As a set of prompts, guidelines, or instructions, a score comes alive when it's read and interpreted. And as such, it's a language that begets other languages. It doesn't tell people what to think as much as it asks to be transformed into something else. It's a way to provide direction in the form of a question. For me, an institution's music mission statement can be understood as a type of a score. Rather than a heavy-handed rhetoric of big claims and big promises, I find myself drawn towards mission statements that doesn't prescribe or predetermine what an institution will do, what its program will consist of, what form it wants to take, or what audience it wants to reach. Instead, when conceived as a score, a mission statement can allow for different interpretations to flow in and out so that the institution itself remains in a state of performance. One of my favorite mission statements was one that was once used by the Drawing Center in New York, which was, "What is drawing?" When framed as a question in this way, I felt like it took on the properties of a score because it provided a direction and a specificity, but it allowed its value to come from how it's interpreted and performed. Different people at different moments in history will answer this question in different ways, leading to a different program that engages different audiences. And yet, this constantly changing flow emerges from an unchanging and consistent mission, providing stability, clarity, and purpose to the organization. Just as the performance of a score will sound differently depending on who interprets it, what instruments they use to interpret it, and even what the acoustics of the room are. The answer to the question, "What is drawing?" will change as the institution's leadership and curatorial voices change, as the local, national, and international dialogue around art changes, as political realities change, or as the city around it changes. As a result, an institution stays alive, always in the process of reinterpreting and reimagining itself. I should mention that inspired by this, we wrote a mission statement for the Wattis Institute some years ago that also takes the form of a question, which is, what can we learn from artists today? My hope is that this establishes a core priority of centering artists, learning from artists, following the lead of artists, foregrounding an artist's perspective, and fostering a public forum for a community to learn and benefit from it. But whether this happens via exhibitions or via publishing or via performances, or by doing none of those, but something else entirely, that's all up for grabs. It will depend on who interprets the score, the instruments, the key and the tempo they choose to do it with, and the cultural context within which it's performed, or the acoustics of the room, so to speak. A few years ago, I submitted a proposal to curate a major international biennial. It wasn't well received. Here's what I said. Each venue of the biennial would be an interpretation of a graphic score. While traditional scores tell a performer to play one note followed by another note, graphic scores involve shapes that perform interpret together. In a sense, I was proposing that a mission or a concept statement for an exhibition not take the form of a sentence, or even appear as written language at all, but be simply a graphic score, where each color and shape could refer to a different type of artwork or activity, and where works on view appeared and reappeared within exhibitions, publications, lectures, performances, and so on, always looking and sounding a bit different. My hope was to replace a curatorial agenda or theme with what I referred to earlier, to give the biennial a temperature, a vibration, maybe even some kind of music. I didn't even get to the interview stage. So today, I'd like to try again. I want to try and propose a score for an exhibition, and then narrate how I might interpret that score and conceive of an exhibition. And this time, my score will not be one of these, but will be something that I think you'll already be familiar with. So if that's the score, what's the exhibition? It's an exhibition that I'm calling Drum Listens to Heart, and it's scheduled to open in September at the Wattis Institute in San Francisco. I've already shared some of the thinking that has gone into it, but I'll end this talk by talking through some of the specific ideas and works that have given shape to the show. I should also come clean and admit that what initially inspired this show was not seeing Jose's video, but was a year-long collective research project I did in 2016 and 2017 around the work of David Hammons, whose work has also come up a few times already, much like Jose's video has. And speaking of Jose's video, let's go back to it one more time because it is our score. So one of the things that I see going on here is that it's not just about music or even about rhythm, like Ginwala's Museum of Rhythm, but it relates more specifically to percussion. So Drum Listens to Heart takes percussion as a point of departure, or perhaps it's better to use the adjective, the percussive, and say that the show tries to imagine the artistic and the political through the lens of the percussive. Drumming or percussion occupies a central place in the history of humanity and has appeared in cultural traditions all around the world for not hundreds, but thousands of years. It's reasonable to imagine that music itself began with early humans mimicking and externalizing their own heartbeat, tapping it out with their hands or feet. It's incredibly basic and foundational to the human story. But even if every body has a pulse, and all share that in common, there are countless ways bodies might express that pulse, countless reasons it might choose to do so, and countless structures that govern how they do so. What I mean is that while percussion refers to a particular musical sound or musical activity, it also refers to a wide range of forms and systems far beyond the realm of music. So this exhibition is not about music or about percussion as much as it uses percussion as a way to think about art and politics from a wide range of perspectives. It uses a visitor's familiarity with drumming as an entry point, and then quickly makes clear that they are being challenged to think about the percussive in much broader terms than that. I might even say that the exhibition tries to complicate percussion. One well-known and relevant historical fact is that slave owners outlawed the use of the drum. When I was writing my essay about David Hammons about 5 years ago, I came across a quote by the painter Jack Whitten, who explained how music became so central to Black American life by saying, quote, "When my white slave masters discovered that my drum was a subversive instrument, they took it from me. The only instrument available was my body, so I used my skin. I clapped my hands, slapped my thighs, and stomped my feet in dynamic rhythms." End quote. At the time, I was relating this to how Hammons used his own body as a tool or instrument in his body prints. But what I also realized that it pointed to something powerful about a politics of abstraction. It pointed to how something as abstract as a drum beat could create such a threat and be so potentially subversive so as to actually be outlawed. And it also showed how even a law can't stand in the way of percussion, since drumming doesn't require any special tools or technology, but is always available through one's own body. It made it very clear to me that drumming is involved with things far beyond the realm of music, and that percussion, or the percussive, engages aesthetic, expressive, and political forms more broadly. My sense was that percussion, or what the cultural historian John Mowat calls a percussive field, would create a context to talk about how abstraction and abstract languages can have a political bite or political force. A musical vocabulary or musical metaphors are already being used to talk about the politics of liberation or emancipation, for example. And because this, and perhaps the specificity of percussion or the percussive could outline something more precise about what the abstract has to do with the political. And since cultures all around the world have a connection to percussion, the project could bring together a diverse range of perspectives without being framed as being about that. It could be polyrhythmic by creating polyrhythms, not by being about the polyrhythmic. In conceiving the exhibitions, I immediately knew that if I wanted to complicate percussion and extend its reach beyond the realm of music, the works needed to avoid drums, drumming, or any representation of drums. And I say this with great admiration to the work of Henri Salah here. But I think that I could take as a given that all visitors would know what a drum is and what it looks like, how it works, and it was not something I needed to make visible in the exhibition itself. In fact, the show could push against an established familiarity with percussion as a way to suggest that any form of pre-existing knowledge, any existing familiarity or comfort zone is always subject to challenge and ripe for revision, especially via the language of art. So instead of revolving around the drum or around music, the show revolves around two broader or more abstract ideas. On one hand, the percussive as something physical, but at the same time as something social or ideological. In terms of the physical, it's fairly obvious to say that a percussive gesture is one that involves a strike, an impact, or the making of some mark. Something like this very large painting by Lee Lozano from 1963, which I like because it's not just a strike, but it's a polyrhythmic strike, or many moments of impact happening at once. Or this sculpture by Barry LeVay, for example. Both of these works are immediately and physically percussive, even if neither of them make any sound or involve a drum in any way. David Hammons' basketball prints also came to mind, since they are drawings made by striking paper with dirt using a basketball. Other works relate to the percussive repetitions of mechanical systems or the movements of the industrial assembly line. And it's easy to think about the physical force of pistons or jackhammers as percussive instruments. In a rarely seen undated video by Hammons entitled Gong, the artist is walking by a construction site on a city sidewalk with workers making all kinds of noise with their power tools. And instead of rushing off or covering their ears, as many of us would do, he reappears with a gong and joins in, transforming the construction crew into members of an improvised orchestra. He ensembles the sidewalk. Each of these works also point to how closely the physical nature of the percussive is rooted in the body. About 3 or 4 years ago, I was fortunate enough to spend an afternoon with the late percussionist Milford Graves in his house in Queens, where he told me about going to the source of things and about his search to understand the drum by studying the heart, about how all bodies are drums, each one playing at the speed of its own heart, and all drums are bodies, each one made of a skin that vibrates differently. Music, he would say, is not abstract at all, but involves very concrete vibrations that make physical impact with the space around it, in much the same way as the beating of a heart makes a physical impact with the body that surrounds it. So in order to study the vibrations of the heart, Milford would hook people up on a kind of homemade EKG machine that would measure their heartbeat and he would process the recording through an algorithm, also invented and self-produced, and chart the data in a complex system of measurements. In his later years, he made these incredible sculptures that bring together that sense of the scientific and the empirical with his interest in spirituality, ritual, and his deep knowledge of percussive traditions. It was when Milford passed away last year that I finally settled on a title for the exhibition, Drum Listens to Heart, which is a phrase written on one of these sculptures and gave me a way to dedicate this whole project to him. So the percussive contains the physicality and materiality of a strike or a blow, and also of a vibration or a pulse. But as Milford's sculptures make clear, the percussive also has another foot in specific systems of belief, whether they be spiritual and ritualistic, or capitalist and mechanical in nature. This aspect of the percussive relates to its political or social force. One way to think about this is to think about control or forms of control. The percussive can be a call to order in the sense that a marching drum or a church bell controls and determines the way bodies move. Police batons are percussive instruments. So is a bomb. Behaviors and beliefs are drummed into people with relentless and forceful repetition. In a studio visit with the drummer Eli Kessler a few years ago, he said, "Mitch McConnell is the drummer. He keeps and sets the pace." In that sense, percussion enforces, polices, and authorizes. It demands consensus and obedience. You must march to the beat of the drum or else. A 2012 video by Francis Alise titled Guards, for example, gets at how a percussive military structure turns individuality into conformity, or turns a chaotic but emancipated polyrhythm into a single disciplined beat. But at the same time, the percussive is a force of liberation, emancipation, and healing, sometimes even a necessity for survival. Slave owners were afraid of the drum not only because it could be used to communicate in code, but because it acted as a glue that strengthened a sense of community and collectivity, which could potentially empower a rebellion. In our present day, the percussive is central to protest movements and helps urban activists unite and cohere. And in a more metaphorical sense, it helps them collectively refuse to march to the beat of empire's drum by interrupting its beat, breaking free of it, and replacing it with one of their own. In that sense, the percussive can threaten forms of authority and voice a powerful demand for freedom, and it can do so without uttering a single word, without a hashtag or a manifesto, but via abstraction. What matters even more than having your own agenda is letting others know that it doesn't fit theirs. To keep a rhythm, David Hammons once said, there's always a fight with any structure. And should you let your guard down, quote, they got rhythms for you. And so soon you'll be thinking just like they do. For Drum Listens to Heart, the artist and choreographer Nick Kay is making a new multi-channel piece about the percussive and movement traditions across the African diaspora related to forms of liberation. Because with all things percussive, the body is always involved and dance is central. In the context of a techno rave, percussion can lead bodies to reach a euphoric trance. And in the context of a sacred ritual, the drums are the means through which to access the spirits and to achieve an exalted state. I'm grateful to an artist friend who sent me a copy of Maya Deren's Divine Horseman, and I recommend it to all of you. And I look forward to reading DeForest Brown Jr.'s Assembling a Black Counterculture when it comes out this summer from Primary Information, since it promises a history of techno with a focus on Black experiences in industrialized labor systems. Healing is closely connected to percussion in a wide range of cultures as well. Not only in the context of spiritual rituals, but also with regards to the healing power of vibration and the practice of sound baths. These extraordinary sculptures by Guadalupe Maravilla, which he calls healing machines or disease throwers, refer to his own personal journey surviving cancer and are made by using objects he collected along his path as an undocumented migrant traveling to the US from El Salvador. And these elaborate installations by Mkal Eogakpa from Cameroon involve water dripping onto variant resonant chambers, triggering different types of beat generators, and a recreation of rituals formed by people fleeing state violence in his native Cameroon by finding safety and community in nearby caves. So Drum Listens to Heart weaves all of these different forms of percussion together: physical and socio-political, literal and metaphorical, and juxtaposes instances of physical impact and vibration with forms of control, emancipation, and community building. My colleague, Diego Villalobos, who's been my close conversation partner and collaborator at the WADIS on this project, and who's curating the performance program that accompanies it, describes this research as relating to the question of who is doing the drumming and who is being drummed. And it's true that a beat cuts in a few different ways. It's the part of a song that inspires the body to come alive, but it's also an act of physical violence that forces a body to collapse. To some, the drum is the peaceful and restorative heartbeat of Mother Earth, while to our others, it signals an urgent call to war. And in a moment when historical narratives are being renegotiated to bring forth voices that have been subjected to colonial erasure and systemic racism, this exhibition turns to a form of expression, communication, celebration, and protest that marginalized voices have long used to be seen and be heard. So in the end, I wonder if the percussive can be a way to ensemble. Can it be a political model where diverging perspectives don't agree, disagree, or even work towards consensus, but where they gather, coexist, listen to each other, make something with each other, and mutually adapt to a context as it evolves, like a polyrhythmic ensemble? Could the percussive provide an emancipatory model rooted in the body, where the abstractions of rhythm have political agency? Can the percussive form the basis for a vibrating and invisible undercommons, where difference is mobilized and energized and ensembled rather than resolved? Can the percussive cut into the beat and insert another one in the break, and thereby dislodge or trouble the rhythms of a dominant marching order? Can the percussive generate an aesthetic and expressive language of beats, pulses, tones, and tempos that binds materials and forms to each other in new ways, or that informs new ways people can relate to the world and to each other? To percuss is to vibrate. Sometimes those vibrations simply tickle us, causing a chuckle or a gasp, and provide access to a liberating space outside of reason, intention, or purpose. Other times, those vibrations are strong enough to shake the world, changing it forever. So I think I'll end here, although there's still a lot more to be said. As a physical exhibition, Drum Listens to Heart is actually divided into 3 separate and consecutive chapters, or rhythms, each of which is presented for 6 weeks, which means that visitors only ever encounter a fragment of the exhibition, or only a few of its many beats at a time. Like a heartbeat, the exhibition stays alive by always staying in motion. There's an ambitious live music performance series. There's a film by the artist Alison O'Daniel that weaves together all 3 chapters of the show and re-edits them in non-linear and non-chronological ways. And there is a catalog that includes texts by a diverse range of writers about specific terms that make up a vocabulary or glossary of percussion, such as beat, polyrhythm, tempo, pulse, strike, vibration, tap, break, and so on. So as a whole, Drum Listens to Heart is structured like a polyrhythm, with the 3 chapters of physical works, the live performances, the catalog, and the film all operating together to create distinct yet overlapping rhythms. And once the show opens, and some of you see it and like it or dislike it, and perhaps create other exhibitions or artworks or essays in the future that are informed by it in some way, then it will have become not just a polyrhythm, but an ensemble. I'm not sure if this is relevant, but it occurred to me that the Wattis's website is looks a lot like a graphic score as well. So I know that everyone expects me to play Jose's video one last time, so I'm not going to do that. And instead, I'm going to leave you with the only account I think is worth following on Instagram, which Jose also told me about, which is called Dust to Digital. All right. Thank you.